Alright, so I did Piaget's cognitive developmental stage theory. So just a little bit about him. He was a Swiss psychologist. He was actually a pioneer in the child developmental field in psychology. He was the one who coined this term, and he also invented the clinical method through his research. And ultimately, he just changed the way that people view children and our understanding of them. So a little bit of history about it before his time. Psychology in this time was basically just was mainly based on adults, and children were simply just seen as mini adults like we talked about in class. So we didn't really discover that they had different mental processes and mental structures until Piaget's time. So a little bit about child psychology before his time. This is a little bit of the timeline. So obviously we had the child study movement, and then going all the way up into the early 1900s with Maria Montessori's school. So a little bit more on the child study movement, which we learned about. This was during the time of the Industrial Revolution. And here we really focused on the education of children and why they probably shouldn't be working in the workforce as young as they are, because they are different from adults, and they're just starting to kind of figure this out at the time. So this really did spark the idea of child development. So later in 1894, James Baldwin published his book, and this was over the stepwise theory of cognitive development. So here we're learning that children do learn behavior in steps, so this is kind of just building off of the child study movement and leading up into Piaget. Then in 1905, over in French, we have the intelligence testing that came about from Binet and Simon. Here they're looking at more averages of the scores of the IQ testing on children. So again, we're just starting to see how development is kind of coming into play. And then the last one I'm going to talk about before Piaget was Maria Montessori. So if you have heard of the Montessori schools, they're still a pretty big thing today. And so this is in Italy. She opened the Casa dei Bambini. So basically she was asked by the government to kind of oversee this underserved population in Rome. She ended up opening a school for these children, and then she was supposed to kind of teach them in a traditional way, but she kind of instituted her own methods of like new learning. So she focused a lot on self-instruction and individualized learning in the classroom, so it was really child-led. And so this obviously led to new ways of learning. So then entering Piaget, he was born in 1896 in Switzerland. He studied at the University of Neuchâtel. I'm not sure how you say that, but he actually studied zoology and like philosophy. His career kind of took off when he studied at Alfred Binet's school, and this is where he began to study child development and kind of form his theories. So about Alfred Binet's school, I have no idea how to say that, so if anyone does, okay, well, we'll just look at it. So he opened this school to study children. This is where he kind of instituted his IQ testing. So he was looking at child behavior and what kind of separates the gifted children from children that need more support. And Piaget worked here, and he actually was working to like score the tests of the children. So as he was scoring all of them, he started noticing patterns that the children would make. So children of the same ages would make the same mistakes. So he started to wonder, like, why are the same children making these exact same mistakes? So just a little bit about his research and where he studied. So he was a director and a professor. So this kind of opened up the door of research for him, because he was able to do experiments and naturalistic observations on students. He also studied his own 3 children from birth. So this is kind of where he got a lot of his insight and research. He wasn't super great about recording all of his methods, and since he was a pioneer in this field, he was just learning to develop all these things, so it wasn't like he was basing his theories off of previous knowledge. He was really building the foundation for developmental psychology. So, but yeah, something important to note was that he did kind of develop the clinical interview through this process. So as he would be interviewing the children, he would kind of he would try to ask them structured questions, but then he kind of found out that it was just better to ask unplanned follow-up questions on like why they did the behavior. So yeah, that kind of led to the clinical method. So he has some famed experiments, which I'll talk a little bit about. So the first one kind of correlates to the first stage of his theory. So I'm sure you guys have all heard about object permanence. So obviously this is where the experimenter would show the child a toy or something, and then they would cover it up. And then if the child looked for the toy, they'd be able to demonstrate their understanding of object permanence. So they would understand the toy didn't completely disappear, but it's still there. And so through his studies, he found that children would demonstrate this skill typically around 8 months of age. A second experiment was a 3-mountain one, so there would be a child sitting on one end of the table and then a doll or something on the other side, and the children would have to kind of explain like what the child or what the doll would be able to be seeing. So the child, I don't really know how this, okay, sorry. So this is measuring like ecocentrism, so that's the thought that the kids can only see from their perspective and they can't really like look at it from any other perspective, so this is just kind of learning how they figure that out. So around age 4, the kids are only able to see from their point of view, and then around 7 or 8 they would get the correct perspective from the doll, so they'd be like, okay, this is what the doll is seeing. The third one was some of his conservation tasks, so there was actually 7 of these, which we've all probably learned about, the 2 cups with equal amounts of water, and then the experimenter would pour water into a taller cup, so obviously it would be the same amount, but they would ask the child which one has more water, and children under the age of like 7 would say that the taller glass had more water, even though we all know that they had equal amounts, so they wouldn't demonstrate knowledge of this until around the ages of 9. So the 4th experiment, this kind of looked at middle and high schoolers and their higher learning processes, so instead of physical manipulation with things, or he'd ask me about this pendulum, and he would ask what determines how fast it swings. Would it be like the length, the weight, or the distance the string is pulled? So here this is kind of just looking at children's logical processing. So yeah, this is just a little bit about how he formed his theory. So like I said, through observations and experiments over decades and thousands of children, these are some of the influences that he had. So getting down to his actual theory and his stages, this is just a little bit of an overview from birth all the way to adulthood on his cognitive stages. So the first one is a sensory motor stage, so this is from birth to about age 2. This is where kids are really learning through sensory motor interaction, so those grasping, all those sucking reflexes, things like that. The children will just kind of do it out of reflex, and then they'll learn it to be a voluntary movement. So object permanence, like we just talked about, is achieved in this state. This one is divided into 6 sub-steps, which I'm not going to go through, but just kind of talks about the different reflexes and how they become voluntary movements as the children learn how to control their body and mind. So then the second stage is the pre-operational stage. This is when the children are learning to speak. Symbolic play here is a huge thing, so they're very creative and imaginative. And these are some defining things of that stage. So animism, which is like attributing feelings and thoughts to objects or stuffed animals or toys and things like that. Here it's also important to understand that egocentrism hasn't transitioned, so the child still only sees from their perspective. And then the last stage, this is the one that has some controversy surrounding it. So this is from this is the 3rd stage. The concrete operational stage, so here the children are able to use logic to solve problems, they're able to demonstrate those conservation tasks, and they focus more on centrism, so here they can understand different perspectives. Here are some defining things of those stages. So decentrism, identity, they understand objects have the same qualities, and then reversibility, so they, like in the water experiment, they understand that the water can return to its original state, things like that. So then the last stage is the formal operations stage. This is one that does have some controversy. So this is those higher learning models. So kids will be able to demonstrate understanding of abstract concepts, so things that aren't based in reality. So this would be like your upper level classes like ethics, reasoning, politics. And not all people or cultures really get to this stage, so that's kind of why there's some controversy. So those are some defining characteristics of that stage. And so, I have to be done? Okay.
Ask for questions.
Okay.
Ask for questions.
Can I have questions? Yes.
So why Piaget?
So Piaget was really, like I said, he was the founder of the developmental psychology movement. He really believed that that it wasn't a continuous pattern. So more people believe that it's more of fluid developmental theory. But he would say no, there are these specific stages that children learn in, and they can't achieve the next stage until they have shown all of the qualitative aspects of that stage. So he also showed us that that intelligence isn't a fixed trait, and that it actually occurs through maturation and things like that. So.
Very good. That's all the time we have for today.